The Arizona sun beat down on Samuel Cross like the hammer of God himself, unforgiving and absolute. He knelt in the dust beside a fence post that had seen better days, his calloused hands working the wire stretcher with the kind of precision that only comes from 3 decades of hard labor. The barbed wire gleamed in the afternoon light, 4 strands of Glidden-patterned steel that separated his land from the wild country beyond. Each twist of the tool sent a small metallic screech across the plains, a sound as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. 47 years old, and Samuel Cross looked every day of it. His face was weathered leather, creased by sun and sorrow in equal measure. Gray threaded through his dark hair, more silver than black now, and his hands bore the scars of 1,000 small battles with this unforgiving land. But his eyes, those pale blue eyes that had witnessed too much death, still held a fierce clarity. They were the eyes of a man who had learned that mercy and justice rarely walk the same path, but who chose mercy anyway, every single time. The fence stretched east to west across his property line, marking the boundary of Cross Creek Ranch. 640 acres of desert scrubland, rocky outcrops, and sparse grassland that somehow managed to support 150 head of cattle. It wasn't much, not compared to the sprawling empires of men like Leonard Graves who owned half the county, but it was his, paid for with sweat and blood and the kind of backbreaking work that aged a man faster than time alone ever could. Samuel straightened, pressing one hand to the small of his back where the old ache lived, permanent as the mountains on the horizon. He reached for his canteen, took a long pull of lukewarm water, and surveyed his domain. The ranch house stood a quarter-mile to the north, a simple structure of adobe and timber that Sarah had made into a home all those years ago. The barn where David had died was still there too, rebuilt after the fire but forever haunted by the memory of that night. And on the hill beyond, beneath a lone oak tree, 3 wooden crosses marked the graves of everyone Samuel had ever loved. Sarah, Benjamin, David, his wife, his son, his brother. All gone now, taken by fever and accident and murder, leaving him alone with ghosts and debts he could never repay. $800. That was what he owed to Redemption Bank, and by extension to Leonard Graves, who owned the bank the way he owned everything else in this county. 3 months remained before the note came due, and Samuel had maybe half that amount saved. He would lose the ranch. He knew that. Graves would take it, the way Graves had taken David's land 3 years ago. The way Graves took everything he wanted, hiding behind lawyers and sheriffs, and the veneer of civilization that masked the brutal machinery of theft. Samuel bent back to his work, driving staples into the cedar post with methodical strikes of his hammer. The rhythm was meditative, almost peaceful. Strike, breathe, strike, breathe. This was the language he understood, the vocabulary of physical labor and tangible results. You fixed what was broken. You built what needed building. You protected what you could protect. Simple rules for a simple life, or at least what passed for simple out here in the territories where the law was whatever the man with the most guns said it was. A sound cut through his thoughts, faint at first, barely audible over the whisper of wind through the mesquite. But Samuel had learned long ago to trust his ears the way a blind man trusts his cane. He stopped hammering, head cocked, listening. There it was again. A scream, high and sharp, the sound of pure terror. He was running before he made the conscious decision to move, his body responding to some primal instinct that existed deeper than thought. The brass telescope was in his saddlebag, an heirloom from his father who had carried it through 3 wars and died peacefully in his sleep at 72. Samuel yanked it free, extended it with a practiced twist, and scanned the eastern horizon. 2 miles out, maybe less, a figure in black stumbled through the dry grass. Even at this distance, Samuel could see the distinctive shape of a nun's habit, the white wimple bright against the desert browns and golds. She fell, struggled to rise, fell again, and then Samuel saw it, the sinuous shape sliding away through the grass, its rattling warning lost in the distance but unmistakable in its movement. Rattlesnake. Samuel was already running for his horse before the telescope collapsed in his hands. Apollo stood tethered to a scrub oak, a 12-year-old Appaloosa gelding with more heart than any horse Samuel had ever known. The animal sensed his urgency, ears pricked forward, muscles already tensing for the run. Samuel hit the saddle in one fluid motion, a movement practiced 10,000 times until it became reflex, and drove his heels into Apollo's flanks. The horse exploded forward, hooves tearing up clods of dry earth, mane whipping in the wind. Samuel leaned low over Apollo's neck, urging more speed from an animal already giving everything it had. 2 miles. At a full gallop, maybe 4 minutes, but every second mattered when venom was involved. He had seen what rattlesnake poison could do to a man, had watched David thrash and scream when one bit him back in '82. Samuel had saved him that time, had cut and sucked the venom before it spread too far. He had saved David from the snake, but he had not saved David from the men who burned him alive 2 years later. The ground blurred beneath him, sagebrush and cactus rushing past in streaks of green and brown. His mind was already working through the procedure, the steps he would need to take. Identify the bite location. Cut an X over each fang mark. Suck the venom, spit it out. Don't swallow. Bind the wound, get her to help. Simple steps. Life or death measured in simple steps. He saw her more clearly now as Apollo closed the distance. Young, maybe late 20s, her face pale with shock and fear. She had managed to prop herself against a boulder, one hand clutching her leg where the black fabric of her habit was already darkening with blood. Her eyes found him as he approached, wide with terror and something else. Shame, perhaps, or embarrassment. The look of a woman raised on rules and propriety now facing a situation where those rules meant nothing at all. Samuel pulled Apollo up hard, the horse skidding to a stop in a spray of dust and pebbles. He was on the ground before the animal had fully stopped, his medical bag already in hand. He kept basic supplies in his saddlebag now, ever since Sarah died because he could not get the medicine to her in time. Bandages, laudanum, a clean knife, the tools of amateur surgery in a land where professional help was 2 days right away. The nun tried to speak, her lips moving soundlessly. Up close, Samuel could see the sweat beating on her forehead, the tremor in her hands, the rapid pulse visible in her throat. Shock was setting in, the body's response to trauma and fear. He had maybe 20 minutes before the venom spread enough to cause permanent damage, maybe 40 before she died. He dropped to his knees beside her, his voice calm and level despite the urgency screaming through his veins. "Sister, my name is Samuel Cross. I am going to help you, but I need to see the wound. Do you understand?" She nodded, tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks. Her hand moved to her leg, hesitated, moved again. The conflict was written across her face as clearly as words on a page. Years of training, of rules and vows, and the strict doctrine of modesty, all warring against the animal instinct to survive. "I cannot," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It is not proper. I took vows before God. I cannot let a man touch me. I cannot show you. I cannot." Samuel had no time for this. He understood her fear, understood the weight of those vows, but understanding would not save her life. "Sister," he said, and his voice carried the kind of authority that came from burying everyone he loved. "I see 2 fang marks on your leg. The venom is hemotoxic. That means it destroys tissue. It is already spreading through your bloodstream. I need to cut the wound and suck out the poison. If I do not do this in the next 15 minutes, you will lose that leg. If I do not do this in the next 30 minutes, you will die. Your vows will not matter if you are dead. Do you understand?" She stared at him, and Samuel saw the moment the decision crystallized behind her eyes. Not acceptance exactly, more like surrender. The acknowledgement that sometimes survival required breaking the very rules that defined you. "Do it," she breathed. "Quickly. Please, just do it quickly." Her hands shook violently as she gathered the fabric of her habit, lifting it with agonizing slowness. Samuel kept his eyes on hers, giving her what dignity he could in this moment when all dignity had been stripped away. Only when she had exposed the wound did he look down. High on her right thigh, just above where her black stockings ended, 2 puncture marks wept blood and clear fluid. The skin around them had already begun to swell, turning an angry red that would soon darken to purple. He could see the tracks where the fangs had penetrated, could calculate the depth and the probable amount of venom injected. Western diamondback, probably 4 feet long, judging by the distance between the punctures. A mature snake, which meant a full load of poison. Samuel pulled his Bowie knife from its sheath, 9 inches of carbon steel that his father had carried and his grandfather before him. The blade caught the sunlight, throwing sharp reflections across the woman's terrified face. He reached for his canteen, poured water over the steel, a token gesture at cleanliness in a situation where infection was the least of their worries. "This will hurt," he said simply, because there was no point in lying. He made the first cut, a shallow X directly over the upper fang mark. The sister gasped but did not cry out. Her jaw clenched so tightly Samuel could see the muscles jumping beneath her skin. Blood welled immediately, bright red against pale flesh. He made the second cut over the lower puncture, the same careful depth, just enough to open the wound without hitting anything vital. Then Samuel bent his head and pressed his mouth to her thigh. The taste was immediate and foul, a mix of blood and venom and the salty tang of skin. He sucked hard, pulling the poison into his mouth, careful not to swallow, careful to keep his lips sealed around the wound. After 3 seconds, he turned his head and spat into the dirt, a stream of dark fluid that stained the sand. Again, suck, spit, suck, spit. 4 times he repeated the process until the liquid he expelled ran more red than yellow, until he could taste only blood and not the bitter chemical burn of venom. He looked up to tell her it was done, to offer some word of comfort or reassurance, and froze. A wagon had stopped on the road 30 yards away. Not a small buggy or a single rider, but a freight wagon, the kind merchants used to haul goods between Redemption and the smaller settlements to the east. 3 women stood in the back, all dressed in their Sunday clothes, all staring with identical expressions of shock and horror. And beside the wagon, holding the reins of the team, sat Ezra Boone, a farmer Samuel knew by reputation, if not by friendship. Samuel understood immediately what they saw. A man kneeling between a woman's legs, his face pressed against her exposed thigh, his mouth stained red. They could not see the snake that had already slithered away. They could not see the fang marks hidden by his position. They could not see anything except what their minds wanted them to see, what their gossip-hungry souls needed them to see. The biggest woman, Harriet Boone, if Samuel remembered correctly, pointed at him with one trembling finger. Her mouth opened, and the scream that emerged was shrill enough to startle birds from the nearby mesquite. "Lord have mercy! He is defiling a nun! Someone stop him! Stop him right now!" Samuel slowly straightened, his hands held out to his sides in a gesture of peace. Blood dripped from his chin. The sister's habit was still bunched around her waist. There was no arrangement of facts, no explanation that would make this scene look like anything other than what they thought it was. "Now hold on," Samuel started, his voice calm despite the adrenaline spiking through his system. "This woman was bitten by a rattlesnake. I was removing the venom. That is all that happened here." Ezra Boone's face had gone red, the color of a man whose sense of righteousness had been offended. He stood up in the wagon box, one hand reaching for something beneath the seat. Samuel tensed, calculating distances and angles, wondering if he would have to fight his way out of an act of mercy. "Liar!" Harriet Boone shrieked. "We saw what we saw. You had your mouth on her, on a woman of God. You animal, you filthy animal." "Ma'am, if you would just let me explain." But they were not interested in explanations. Harriet turned to her companions, both of whom nodded eagerly, already composing the story they would tell, already building the narrative that would spread through Redemption like wildfire. The second woman, thin and pinched-looking, actually smiled as she spoke. "We should tell Reverend Clark immediately. He will know what to do. He will make sure this man faces justice." "Justice?" Samuel felt anger rising now, hot and sharp in his chest. "Justice for saving a life?" But the wagon was already turning, Ezra Boone whipping the team into motion with more violence than necessary. The women clung to their as the vehicle bounced over the rough ground, their voices carrying back across the desert air. "Wait until the town hears about this. A nun! He assaulted a nun! String him up! That is what they should do! String him up!" Samuel watched them disappear in a cloud of dust, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists. Beside him, the sister had pulled her habit back down, her face now pale for reasons that had nothing to do with snake venom. She looked up at him, and in her eyes Samuel saw the understanding, the terrible knowledge of what was about to happen. "They will not believe the truth," she said quietly. "Will they?" Samuel turned back to her, forced his anger down into that deep place where he kept all his rage. He pulled bandages from his bag, began wrapping her thigh with steady hands. No, sister, they will not believe the truth. Truth is not nearly as interesting as scandal. And in a town like Redemption, scandal is the only entertainment most folks have. He tied off the bandage, checked the tightness, not a tourniquet, just firm enough to protect the wound. She would need real medical attention, a doctor if they could find one, but for now she would live. The venom he had removed, the poison would not spread. She would hurt for days, would carry the scars forever, but she would survive, unlike Samuel's reputation, which had just died in front of 3 witnesses. "Can you ride?" he asked. She nodded, using his arm to pull herself upright. She swayed and Samuel caught her before she fell, one arm around her waist, feeling the sharp edges of her ribs through the heavy fabric. Too thin, he thought. They did not feed her enough at that convent. But then, religious devotion often came with a side of deprivation. He helped her onto Apollo, then swung up behind her. The horse snorted at the double weight, but did not complain. Good old Apollo, steady and reliable as the sunrise. Samuel turned the animal north, toward the white walls of St. Catherine Convent, visible on the horizon. They rode in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the rhythmic thud of hooves and the woman's labored breathing. Finally she spoke, her voice so soft Samuel had to lean forward to hear. "Why did you help me? You must have known what it would look like." Samuel considered the question, considered all the possible answers. Because it was the right thing to do. Because he was a doctor once, before the war took that dream away. Because he could not stand by and watch another person die. But in the end, he spoke the truest answer, the one that lived in the deepest part of his soul. Because I could not save my wife when the fever took her. I could not save my son when his neck broke. I could not save my brother when they burned him. Maybe God gave me one more chance to get something right. Maybe this was it. She was quiet for a long moment. Then so quietly he almost missed it, she said, "Thank you." They crested a small rise and St. Catherine Convent came into full view. It was not a large structure, just a 2-story adobe building with a bell tower and a small courtyard surrounded by a low wall. Maybe 20 nuns lived there, providing education to the handful of children in the area and medical care to anyone who could not afford a real doctor. Samuel had never been inside. He had no reason to enter a convent, and the nuns had no reason to seek out a widowed rancher living alone with his ghosts. He pulled Apollo to a stop at the main gate, helped the sister slide down from the saddle. She winced as her injured leg took weight, but she stayed upright, one hand pressed against the gate for support. "What is your name?" Samuel asked, "in case I need to testify about what happened here." "Margaret," she said, "the Sister Margaret Louise Hartwell. And I will tell them the truth, Mr. Cross. I will tell them you saved my life." Samuel looked down at her, at this small woman in black who had just promised to stand against the tide of gossip and accusation that was surely building even now. He wanted to tell her it would not matter, that her truth would be drowned out by lies. But he saw something in her eyes, a core of steel beneath the fear, and he decided not to insult her courage with his cynicism. "I believe you will, sister. I truly do. But truth and justice are not always friends, particularly not in a place like Redemption. Just remember that when they start asking questions." He touched the brim of his hat in salute, turned Apollo, and rode away without looking back. He had work to do, fences to mend, cattle to check. And he had maybe 3 hours before Sheriff Nathaniel Blackwood came looking for him with irons and accusations. 3 hours to prepare for the storm he saw gathering on the horizon. Margaret watched him disappear into the desert shimmer, one hand still gripping the iron gate. She had spent 8 years behind these walls, believing her vows were holy service. But standing here with her leg throbbing and blood still damp on the bandages, a question slithered through her mind like the snake that had bitten her. Had she taken those vows from devotion or from cowardice? Had she been serving or hiding from life? The thought terrified her more than the rattlesnake's fangs ever had. She pushed it down deep, but it would not stay buried. Behind him, the convent gate creaked open, and Sister Margaret disappeared into the white walls, limping but alive. Samuel allowed himself one moment of satisfaction. Whatever else happened, whatever lies were told and believed,